The main thing is that you eat meat and animal fat and not plants to the best of your ability, as close to 100% as you can get. And any small transgression, probably you're going to get a worse outcome than you think would be fair or reasonable. That's just the way it is. What I can tell you is, as an unassailable scientific fact, there is no acceptable cause and effect evidence which can implicate LDL or cholesterol itself being involved causally in heart disease, atherosclerosis. None. My answer for omega-3 supplementation is don't. Personally, I think it's an absolute contraindication. I would not touch an omega-3 supplement with a barge pole, personally. The thing to absolutely not do is all this zone 2 endurance, aerobic or cardiovascular style training. And if you say, oh, but my sport requires me to do that, then my suggestion is you rethink your sport. The weight will come off when the inflammation is resolved. If you are inflamed, you will not be particularly successful in weight loss. You might be able to do it, but it will be a hard road. It will be tough yards.
Hi, Bart. Great to have you back on the show.
Hey.
I know we recently chatted, but you have a wealth of knowledge. It's good to have you back on. We're going to get into a lot of other nuance today. And part of what you wanted to cover today is a correction of something you talked about last time. So I'll have you begin there.
Yeah, not really so much. We don't really need to talk about it so much. This is just a simple misspeak that I made last time I was on the show. Quite easy to do when you're looking at a camera and, realizing that you've got to be on your game and stuff. We were talking about getting various electrolytes from various salts, or what a good salt source of various electrolytes might be. And we were talking about potassium, and I misspoke and said Epsom salt is a good place to get potassium. No, it isn't. That's magnesium. No salt is where you get potassium. It's potassium chloride. So sorry about that. I stand corrected by me.
All right. Well, thank you for addressing. I did see that one in the comments. So there we go. I want to start talking about calories. And I think a good segue into this is this experiment you did. I think it's been a couple years now, where you upped your calories for a period of 2 weeks. And I think you got them up to 6,000, 6,500 calories a day, priming your body. So talk about what you're trying to achieve there and what came of it.
Right. This came about as a series of videos I was making with a friend of mine. And this is Coach Raymond Nazen over there stateside. And he has a program of helping people to optimize their body composition using dietary intervention as the primary control lever. And his theory is that the vast majority of people coming from even quite good diets without being perfect, the majority of those people present in the first instance with some quite glaring nutrient deficiencies, as it turns out. Deficiencies that could all be cured by piling in a bunch of meat and fat. And so that's where we start. We start with a 2-week period of what Raymond is calling priming. And that is, you take what you would normally eat in a 1 meal a day situation and you eat that 3 times in the day or 4 times in the day. In other words, you eat to the point where you're full up and rifting. After about 7 days of this, the feeling is like, I actually never want to see food again in my life, which obviously is wrong, but that's what you feel like at the time. It's like the thought of having to have another meal, you could almost burst into tears because you just can't eat. It's not a pleasant thing. And people think, oh, great, I can eat all I like. It's not good. It's horrible. It's not a pleasant thing to do. But at the end of that, stacking in all of this so-called calories, you end up in a situation where your body is fully replete with everything it needs going forward. And then the program that Raymond has then rolls into some fasting and or intermittent fasting and rolling 48-hour fasts and this kind of stuff. It's all about food freedom. It actually frees people up from addiction to other non-helpful, non-food substances that people like to eat a lot. But also it's vastly, hugely effective in terms of body composition. And people that want to see the before and after photos of when I did that could look at the YouTube channel because it's there in a 5-minute video, just a quick. People say, oh, those 2 photos were taken with different lighting from different angles. Fine, whatever. Yes, But look at the difference between the photos. It swamps any, error introduced by a different perspective or different lighting, for goodness sake. One is a dad bod situation, and the other is a six-pack abs situation, separated by a period of 90 days. Okay? Anyway, so that's what we're doing with priming. We're stuffing in food till we can stuff no more food in, actually. So, yes, in effect, if I were to take what's written on the labels of everything I ate, if it had labels, because most of my meat isn't supermarket meat or anything like that with a label on it. It actually lived here on this property, most of it. But based on the weight of meat and associated fat consumed by me in those 14 days of priming, the lowest intake day was around about just over 6,000, and the highest one was just under 6.5, as you said. 1,000 calories, kcalories, that is, which is nominally about 4 times my normal intake. So if calories in, calories out was correct, because I also did not change my activity patterns, not one jot, actually, then the rules of calories in, calories out dictate absolutely that I must have gained quite a bit of weight during that 14 days. And I didn't. That did not occur. What occurred actually was I lost 15 pounds while eating 4 times the amount of food that I normally do. Oh, yes, but that was probably water, people say. Yes, a lot of it was. About 12.5 of those 15 pounds were water. The rest was fat, plus or minus the error margin of the bioelectrical impedance scale I was using for that little self-experimentation. So I lost fat during a period of 2 weeks, eating vastly more fat than I normally do. How does that work? Somebody please explain that to me, because calories in, calories out is a fact, absolutely, that we all must accept. It's just thermodynamics, isn't it, is what people say, not understanding that thermodynamics does not apply to an open system like a human being, because thermodynamics, the law they're talking about is the first law of thermodynamics, which explicitly in its formulation excludes open systems. Anyway, so that's what happened.
Were you surprised by that result?
Not really. I expected to either stay around about the same or perhaps gain maybe a couple of pounds.
Talk about over the next couple of months then, too. You mentioned this being a 90-day thing in total. What happened then?
Oh, I think it was about 20 pounds different over the 90 days in the downward direction. I lost about 20 pounds. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's not much. Well, sure, but my entire frame size, like as I sit right now speaking to you, I'm about 140 pounds total. So relatively, it's quite significant, I think. Others are achieving bigger numbers, of course, because they've got bigger places to start from. What I'm saying is I'm not one of the hugest framed individuals in the world.
And how far back was this?
Oh, this is a couple of years ago now. I think it was beginning of 22.
Okay. And
maybe
at the end of that 90-day period, did you notice that weight come back on gradually to your normal baseline?
It did over the next 10 months, 9 or 10 months, because I slid back into my usual pattern of behavior, which is not perfect or ideal. It's not what I suggest to people they should do. A lot of people say, well, you're not in shape. And I say, well, that's because I don't do what I suggest people should do. Oh, well, that makes you not very credible then. No, it makes me real. I'm telling you, I'm a human being too.
If you're enjoying this episode, let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the show. What did you take away from that experience? Things that you're carrying forward to today?
Right. So what occurred patently is that when I changed to a diet specific to my species, I removed everything from my diet that is not as nature intended we should eat as a species, stuff that we've invented ourselves. Just get rid of all of that. And even if I consume vastly more than I require, of that appropriate diet, that still leads to a situation where my inflammasome calms right down, my immune system calms right down, my endocrine system balances out, my hormonal balance is all optimized. And my body says, well, I don't need all of this excess water and that very small amount of excess fat that's sitting around anymore. Nothing whatever to do with calories. Nothing at all. And in fact, believing this calories in, calories out idea, as people are telling us we must, the only way that works, because it's so inaccurate, is that you actually have to undercut your diet, your normal diet intakes, by so-called 500 calories a day. And they say, well, just keep doing that until you've lost all the weight. By which time, because you've been so under eating, your metabolism is now destroyed. These people ought to be locked up, is what I'm saying. Sorry, Jesse, go on.
For somebody that has done that, following conventional wisdom to lose weight, do they have any hope of fixing the metabolism?
Yeah, I say destroyed. I mean destroyed at that time. You can get it back by changing your patterns in the right way, towards the right direction. Absolutely.
So how do you think about calories these days? Any value whatsoever?
I don't personally place any value on them at all, because at the end of the day, a calorie is a measurement of heat energy. And that is not how the human system runs. That's not the currency we use. It's completely irrelevant. It's using a currency that is so vastly, grossly, hugely inaccurate at gauging the actual biological process that's going on in terms of equivalence, that it's laughable. Added to that, the fact that the number of calories listed on a food, on its label, on its nutrition label, is allowed to be out by 20% plus or minus in most countries. You have no hope of accurately counting how many so-called calories you are in effect consuming, let alone measuring how many you're spending. You need very, very expensive kit in laboratory situations with 7 or 8 PhDs to run that kit to actually get anywhere close to tracking either in or out calories. It's ludicrous. What you need to do is forget that idea entirely. And if you own a scale, by the way, in your house, a weighing scale, get it out of your house. It's not helpful. All right. Here's what you do. You translate your current diet, whatever it is, to 100% carnivore, but you take 6 or 8 weeks over that transition. You don't do that in one, I'm going carnivore tomorrow. Don't do that, please. Slowly. 6 to 8 weeks. Right, now I'm a carnivore going forward. Everything else will take care of itself from there. That's it.
Okay. Any other variables we can put into the mix? Diet aside?
Well, exercise. Exercise, obviously, is an important part of the mix. But actually, if I was going to give you my mix of what people should do in order of priority, I always place them in the same order, and it's always number 1 is a carnivore diet. That's most of the battle, but not all of it. The second most important thing is to take cereal products on a daily basis. Where do you get those? Well, you get them at that address there, that one. All right? Very important. They encourage stem cell release, which is renewing and repairing your tissues, and also it's vastly, hugely anti-inflammatory. So that's why I suggest those products, of course. Number 3 is to ground yourself electrically for as much of the time as is possible. Number 4 is to block blue light from your eyes after sundown and before sunup. And number 5 is exercise of the right kind, of the right intensity, on the right schedule, all of that.
All right. We're going to take some time and get through all of these. Let's stick on the diet for now.
Yeah.
You mentioned carnivore. That's going to be a huge leap for a lot of people. A lot of people just are going to dismiss that and not even jump in because that's so extreme. How do you feel about low carb as an entry point or a long-term strategy for weight loss?
Low carb can be a gateway to carnivore, and many low carbers find their way eventually to carnivore. I'm one of those myself. The reason that they find their way to carnivore eventually is because low carb is close, but it doesn't get the job done.
Talk more about that. Where does it fall short?
The design, if you like, And when I say design, I mean positive and negative selection pressures, your organ systems, the way your biological pathways are mapped out, the chemical reactions that occur, all of that. All of those things are geared around a diet that does not contain any significant amount of carbohydrates. Your body is capable of manufacturing all the carbohydrate that is required, and it does so if you just get out of the way and let it do that. When you start piling excess carbohydrate in on top of that, above a certain physiological level, that will become very, very toxic, and does become very, very toxic, demonstrably. The only more toxic thing that people typically are pouring down their necks every week than sugar, which means all carbohydrates because they all break down to sugar, the only more toxic thing that you can pour down your neck really is seed oils. So we added carbohydrates in any significant amount to our diets at the time of the agrarian revolution, circa 9 to 12,000 years ago, depending what part of the world you're talking about. Before then, the stable isotope testing from collagen of long bones of human remains of all ages found all over the world for at least the last 350,000 years, I think it is, they all agree, and they all say human beings actually ate basically no carbohydrates at all.
Okay. Again, coming back to my point of being realistic, though, for a lot of people, that's not going to happen.
Sure.
You mentioned there being a certain threshold of carbohydrates where we should not push the body beyond that. How do we find that spot?
The most direct, most accurate way of doing it probably is to go directly to where you would need to go to gauge what your body is doing in regard to how well it's handling carbohydrates. And that is to do a continuous blood glucose monitoring period, get an area under that curve and see how it's reacting to different meals at different times of the day under different circumstances and things like that. And that will give you probably the best gauge on how your body is tolerating that exogenous toxin, because that's what all carbohydrates are. Now, there are many contributing factors that can affect how a body's person will handle and deal with carbohydrate. And this is all managed by a thing called the Randle cycle, but we'll get to that if we get to it at some point. Ostensibly, the cutoff threshold of where do carbohydrates become toxic is very individual. However, most people seem to perform best at the extremely low end of carbohydrate intake. In terms of metabolically, how do they perform? How does their system function? Those are the ones who seem to be the best.
We did talk about the Randle cycle last time, but I think this is a good place to bring it back in because it's going to be so important for a lot of these concepts. So tie in what that is and how it works.
Right. Well, the Randle cycle is, first of all, badly named because it is not a cycle. So that's the first point. It's a series of interactions between different components, if you like, of your metabolic machinery, if you like to think of it as such. The various enzymes, reactions and things, the various transport proteins, the various different geographical isolations between different components and things. The Randle cycle is not an on-off phenomenon. Is the second thing to understand. It's not like a switch. You turn this thing on or you turn it off. It's a set of faders that the effect of which combined determines how a cell will react, how it will metabolically proceed, how it will deal with the substrate that is on hand now. What is flowing through that? What is flowing through the mitochondria in that cell at that time? That determines what that cell is doing in terms of Randle cycle. A cell right next door might be doing something quite different. And then the overall body response to every individual cell's slider, fader level of all of these things gives us what people generally think about as this thing they talk about as insulin resistance, which is just a construct. And it's a false one because insulin resistance is imagined to be universally. This is a pathology. This is something we need to cure. This is the underpinning cause of diabetes, they say, this insulin resistance. No, diabetes is elevated blood glucose and nothing else. You can have elevated insulin and not elevated glucose, and you will not be diagnosed as a diabetic because that's not what diabetes is. Diabetes is elevated blood glucose. That's the thing that's the drugs are targeted at. That's the thing that's ameliorated. That's the thing that's problematic because glucose in high concentration is toxic to human tissue. It destroys it by binding to it and changing the fundamental shape of proteins and fats and things in such a way as to mess up its function and destroy it. And it's not good at all. So the cells have a mechanism by which to protect themselves from too much glucose. And that's the thing that's referred to as the Randle cycle. For details on the Randle cycle, I've actually got an hour-long instructional video on my channel, which is the most recent one I've made on the topic, which was featured on Judy Cho's summit recently. But people can find that on my channel if they like. Just search for Randle cycle and look at the most recent version of that lecture, if you like, if you want to learn all about it. But it says this: sugar in the form of glucose entering or flowing through the mitochondria of cells that are using that sugar for oxidative purpose to produce ATP. The flow of that sugar through those metabolic pathways discourages that mitochondria from uptaking and using fat. Well, that's no surprise. Number one, we've got to get the sugar down quickly because it's toxic above a certain level. The fat can sit there and cause no problem whatever in terms of toxicity. Once sugar rate flowing through a cell is maximized and can go no higher, what then happens is the fader starts to slide on and that sugar starts inhibiting its own entry into the cell, but only once we're at kind of maximum usage rate. On the other hand, if you've got fat in your blood and fat is pouring into your cells and fat is pouring through the mitochondria and firing the exact same reactions, if you like, I should say stimulating, not firing, then that fat flowing through those same pathways has a powerful inhibitory effect on glucose entering the cell and flowing through those pathways. It blocks them off. So what I'm saying is carbohydrate quite powerfully blockades fat, and fat quite powerfully blockades carbohydrate. They cross-inhibit is the word I'm looking for. So a person who eats a diet where there's a lot of fat and a lot of glucose trying to pour through their energetic systems at once, that person will find themselves behind the eight ball. They will find the redox potential of their cells drops with respect to someone who doesn't do that. And that will place that person in a pro-inflammatory situation overall, systemically, and that will lead that person to a vastly increased probability by way of that mechanism to all the sequelae involved in inflammatory situations. So what are we talking about? Atherosclerosis, heart disease, strokes, many forms of cancer. We can go through this whole list. All the big killers in Western society. All underpinned, it seems, at the root by people not understanding that the diet of any animal actually is supposed to be 2 out of the 3 macros not a mix of all three. Think about sources of food in nature. There's only one I can think of that is a mixture of all three that will absolutely activate this Randle cycle situation. Do you know what it is?
Not off the top of my head.
It's breast milk. Now, why does breast milk have all three in it? Why does breast milk activate this Randle cycle problem, cause inflammation a bit? Well, it's because it also has a positive effect. When the Randle cycle is highly activated and fat cannot be burned for energy, then it's going to be stored.
Helps baby put on weight.
To put on weight. So they have a growth spurt from that stored energy as the fat in the first 6 to 8 months, a year or so of life. So I know some people breastfeed longer than that. Fine, whatever. It's your funeral, as you like. So that's why. Everything else, when you think about foods provided by nature, plants are carbohydrates and proteins, but not very much fat in general. Animals are a lot of fat and protein, but not very much carbohydrate. So now all we need to know is, okay, are we an animal that's designed by natural selection to get our nutrition from the flesh and fat of other animals, or are we designed to get our nutrition by eating plants? And the answer to that one is absolutely unequivocal and simple and straightforward. One of those diets provides everything we need, and the other diet, the one based on plants, is destitute of nutrition for a human being. So the decision's easy.
Okay. This comes back to my point, though, I want to make sure we cover. How do we know when we're hitting that threshold and going beyond? Because again, very few people are going to adopt a carnivore diet. And if they do, very few are going to stick on that 24/7.
Right.
So how do we know when we're pushing into that Randle cycle and causing inflammation?
Okay, probably the best way is to get a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, install it, and keep an eye on it so you can see what shape that curve is and how you're reacting to the intakes of various meals and things. What you're looking for as a problem is more than about one spike in your blood glucose in a day. Multiple spikes in your glucose, not a good thing. Or that your baseline glucose level drifts up above, 5.6, 5.7, around about there. That starts to look like a problem, potentially, at that point. Now, an individual person will reach that outcome dependent on what they're eating, how they're moving their body around in space over time, what they do for a job, how stressed they are, how polluted their environment is, whether they live in a city or in a country, all those kind of things, absolutely. But when someone comes to me and says, okay, my A1C is now heading towards 6, that's when I would start talking to that person about, okay, how much protein are you eating? How much carbohydrate are you eating? In what form, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe we tweak it, maybe we don't, depending on their situation and what other presentations that person might have in terms of things that would lead me to believe that the potential for them to have a problem health-wise down the track is increased for some reason.
Somebody tuning in right now might be saying to themselves, okay, carnivore diet, how am I going to get that insulin spike? And we did talk about this last time. It's all about how you're intaking that meat, and you're an advocate of having it all within one bolus. So you're actually going to get that insulin spike once a day.
Yeah, and again, I think we should be careful with the term spike. Spike is what happens to your insulin when you dump glucose quickly into your bloodstream. It goes, it responds to the glucose spike. What I'm really talking about a person needing on a daily basis is not so much one of these, but it's more a sleeping policeman or a bump in the road. Sometimes they're called judder bars in various parts of the world. I don't know. Those things they put across the road to stop people speeding. It's just a little one of those. And you get that by having one meal a day, eating sufficient protein, which has a gluconeogenic effect and an insulogenic effect.
I want to come back to insulin. You mentioned insulin resistance. How do you feel about high insulin in the blood as a whole, though? When you talked about insulin resistance, you talked about its connection to diabetes, that being a glucose problem. That I think everybody can agree with. But elevated insulin in the blood and the body producing more over time, as is in the case with how insulin resistance is classically described, hyperinsulinemia, is that an issue in and of itself?
Well, show me some evidence that it is, and I'll be interested.
I'm here just to get your thoughts.
Right. Well, I'm not convinced at all that hyperinsulinemia is a pathology. In the same way that I'm absolutely convinced that the reason the Randle cycle exists is precisely to protect our important complex cells from being destroyed by allowing too much sugar to pour into them. It's an adaptive thing. Our genes have developed and evolved according to selection pressures for many thousands of millions of years. And, all of these things occur for a reason. So if we have a mechanism to protect ourselves, which stops our body from reacting to insulin, thus disallowing that pathway, if the elevated insulin itself were also a problem, then the body would have evolved a means of dealing with that too, if it had been exposed to that for a long enough period of time for the genes to develop such a solution, because that's how evolution works. No such pathway seems to exist. The insulin is allowed to go up and up and up by the body. It does not dispose of it in some way. Therefore, it's unlikely to be problematic.
But when you think it could possibly lead to things like cancer being a growth hormone?
Well, again, I would respond to those kind of mechanistic speculations with a challenge to provide me with some evidence and practice that there has been a scientific observation that it is so. In other words, an experiment by which you subject a group of genetically identical human beings to proper control, by locking them in a lab for their whole lives, okay, and controlling absolutely every aspect of those human beings' lives, except for exposing one of those twins in each set to this so-called cancer-causing agent and not the other one, to see what happens to rates of the development of cancer over a lifetime. Ethics committees hate that sort of thing. You can never get that study signed off. It will not, even if you had the money, the patience, all the logistics to be able to do it. No, that's what's required to say something is cause and effect, whatever. Any inference below that quality is just that, it's an inference. It's an idea that this might be so. In which case, I would challenge you to show me a meaningful difference in cancer rates. And then explain to me how that's not confounded by other things that might have been involved in cancer, for example. Because I'll tell you what, people who have a lot of body fat, for example, tend to be more represented in the group of people who are so-called hyperinsulin sufferers in their blood. Those people also suffer more cancers.
Well, that's where I was going next. People that have more insulin, aren't they going to have more body fat on them?
Not necessarily.
And then people that are injecting insulin for type 2 diabetes, wouldn't that cause them to continue to gain weight and become fatter and fatter?
The problem here is that we're trying to make assertions and inferences based on proxy measurements. We're going around the bases to try and make an inference that we cannot make using the actual scientific disciplines and methodology because of ethics, practicalities, finances, etc. As such, every time we make a step of faith around this logical loop, at every single point, there is the likelihood that we make an error in terms of this is a causal artifact of that, precisely because of what I've just outlined to you there. There is a collinearity between insulin in the blood, fat carriage, and cancer. They're all related linearly. There's a collinearity. Ergo, there's no way of teasing out which is the cause. We can speculate as to which might be more likely, but we can't prove it. That's beyond science. Science can't do that.
I wouldn't want to be the one testing that on my body, though, with the hyperinsulin.
This is the problem. It's an ethical dilemma. You cannot ask people to undergo an experiment which will place them at risk of a health problem, or even potentially. Ergo, we have to retrospectively look at prospective cohort studies and say, this is what was observed. Whoops, no, it wasn't, because most of those studies are adjusted. So fabricated data sets, even. What I'm saying is that this area of ring-fenced ideology called human nutrition science, it's a cesspool. It's rubbish, all of it. And I'm not just a bitter old man. I've actually been involved in that industry at the coalface. I'm a well-published scientist in the fields of human physiology and human nutrition, among others. I've seen what goes on in that industry. And when I say to you, it's a cesspool in there, and if you think you're going to get knowledge and definitive facts out of looking at that stuff, I'm sorry, you're deluded.
Coming back to what we said before, the ideal would be the carnivore diet according to the way you see things. Low carb would be next in line. Whether somebody adopts either of those diets, it's likely their LDL is going to go up. They're going to go see their doctor. Their doctor is going to flag that and say, we have an issue here. How do you look at all that?
Right. Number one, using the exact same logic, ostensibly, as the last point, what I can tell you is, as an unassailable scientific fact, there is no acceptable cause and effect evidence which can implicate LDL or any subfraction of LDL or any of the lipoproteins associated with LDL or cholesterol itself being involved causally in heart disease, atherosclerosis. None. There is a bought and paid for, again, ring-fenced area of ideology there, suggesting, well, we have all this causal evidence, they say, despite the fact that they, in fact, have no causal evidence, none whatsoever. They have an inference which they have decided collectively as good enough for them to accept on the basis that they can't actually meet the threshold to prove something. So the actual discipline that should be imposed on communicating about what the science can tell us about that area is to do what I've just said. And that is to say, there is a mechanistic speculation, a hypothesis around one of those aspects I've just said, of those things of lipoproteins and cholesterol and all of that, one of them being involved in the process of heart disease causally somehow. We know that's the theory. It's called the lipid hypothesis. Notice what it's called. It's called the hypothesis. It's not called the established lipid fact. And no amount of publishing studies which are theologically based, which say absolutely and scream from the rooftops that we now have causal evidence, it's still being called the lipid hypothesis because scientists understand that actually that's just words that they've used. Causal inference, they've said. This causes that. It doesn't make it true. Science is litigated with empirical data sets, not with words on the page. And a scientist is someone who is competent to pick up one of these papers and see through the words on the page and look at the data set collected under the methodology collected and go, right, is that capable of telling me what they're telling me it's telling me? And this is why I'm always chelping at people who come online and make themselves out to be expert. And, oh, look, here's a reference saying this, that, and the other thing. Here's another one that says that and the other thing, by splashing that thing up on the screen for 3 or 4 seconds, taking it down again. No, that's not doing science, and that's not showing you're competent to read science. Reading words on a page doesn't mean you can actually look at those numbers, which is what the science actually is. So if you are a person who could not pick up a science paper, read the data, and do the analysis yourself, you are not competent to speak about that paper publicly. I'm sorry. You are out of your lane. And that's why I'm always telling people, you're out of your lane, because you are. The science is in the numbers. That's where the competence is. Okay? Oh, but this study says it's causal at the end in its conclusions. Doesn't mean it is. That's just what those authors wrote. That's where those authors are allowed to write an opinion about their data set. So, sorry, bring me back on point to the actual question. I know I'm doing the
LDL. We were talking about LDL going up on a low carb or carnivore diet. Any concern there?
Thank you. Yes, right. So there is no evidence there LDL causes any problem, complaint, condition of any kind. None. There is an idea that it might. It's a stupid idea. It's absolutely ridiculous to try and point the finger of blame at a lipoprotein carrier of lipids in our bloods. It's there for a purpose. It's there because there's a length of DNA encoding for its production. So now you're telling me that the human body is stupid enough to produce a protein that's going to kill us. That protein being the one that carries lipid around in our bodies, the very thing that keeps us alive. That's the best that genetics could do over many thousands of millions of years? Hello? No. Let's cover this one just really briefly with just a couple of really simple arguments that I always like to throw out that never get a decent answer. Here they are. Number one, does the blood in the veins and the blood in the arteries, is that the same blood? Is that
yes.
the same blood, the same? Yes, it is. Absolutely good. All right. We're getting somewhere. Now, atherosclerosis, this heart disease that's absolutely caused by cholesterol, apparently, or some aspect of cholesterol.
Apparently.
Where does that occur? Where does that occur?
Only in the arteries.
Correct. In the veins?
No.
No. Okay, we're done with that, aren't we? Does not cause heart disease.
And we've seen that when veins are taken out and implanted into the arterial system, that they can become clogged.
Right. Exactly.
Which is just a fascinating way to tie that together.
Right. So actually, what you need is, well, what's the difference between the veins and the arteries? Well, it's pressure. So you need high pressure. Okay. Do atheroscleroses develop evenly on the surfaces, the inside surfaces of all the arteries?
No.
No. Atheroscleroses develop in very clear patches, very predictable spots in the arterial tree. And they happen to be around the places where there's turbulence of blood flow based around bifurcations or curves, like the aorta, for example, that kind of thing. So it doesn't occur in veins. It doesn't occur in all of the arteries. It only occurs in the very largest of the arteries, and it only occurs at the bifurcation points or indeed on the inside surface of an arch where the turbulence is. So you need pressure and you need turbulence. Okay. Do you need cholesterol for heart disease? No. Is it there? Yes. In the same way that fire crews attend fires, but they're not the cause of them, usually. It's just ridiculous. It's an idea that's had its time. It's an idea that should never have had any time. It's an idea that was put forward basically in order to sell billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of a drug which reduces this harmful cholesterol, which, by the way, has netted for the average human being over a 100-year lifespan a gain of not one single day of lifespan.
And I believe when you're talking about the Randle cycle, you tied in atherosclerosis. So are we saying that the cause, because obviously there is heart disease, it's a thing, just like there is LDL cholesterol in the plaques. Are we blaming that totally on the Randle cycle then and having too much, fat and carbohydrate at the same time?
Well, a person who has highly activated Randle cycle most of the time will necessarily therefore be expressing a level of chronic systemic inflammation by virtue of the lowering of that redox potential in the cells, which leads to an increase in the concentration of inorganic phosphates in the cells, which directly bind to pro-inflammatory cytokines and tell the body, whoops, inflammation response is required. That's the mechanism of that. So in terms of the atherosclerosis, we need high pressure, we need turbulence. We also need inflammation or physical damage or both to those vascular cells. Well, there it is, inflammation. Now you loosen the gap junctions, you make that patch even more susceptible to the atherosclerotic process. Hey, presto, it's away. By the way, how much of an atherosclerosis plaque do you think by volume or whatever, or even by weight, because it's about the same, how much of that do you think is actually cholesterol?
I would be guessing, but I would say, I don't know, 0.2% or something.
Yeah, it's less than 1%. It's very, very small. An atherosclerotic lesion is scar tissue. It's the body repairing an area that's damaged by the pressure and turbulence under the susceptibility caused by inflammation. That's the triad there for heart disease, not cholesterol at all.
Well, the cholesterol that we're talking about now is a good segue into seed oils that you brought up before, because we've been sold the fact that we need to include these in the diet to lower cholesterol because of heart disease.
Yeah.
So let's talk
The
about
exact
how this
opposite
is
is
such
true.
a backwards way of looking at things, because seed oils in and of themselves are problematic. So talk about what they're doing to the body.
Right. So, yes, the theory is that LDL causes heart disease. It does not. Unequivocally, it does not. Ergo, we must lower that level, which is false. We must do no such thing. In fact, if you lower your cholesterol level at large, you actually seem to predispose yourself to a higher likelihood of death from all causes, it seems. It's actually not a benefit or a good idea at all. Seed oils, the problem with seed oils is that they are directly involved in upregulating the activities of two independent but parallel pro-inflammatory pathways. So the onset and vast build-up to this day of heart disease that we're seeing in society, it's highly coincident with the introduction of large amounts of industrial seed oils to our diet.
Talk about that mechanism, the physiology. When we ingest those, what happens?
Right. Okay. So the most direct thing that happens is that you have different pro-inflammatory pathways, different cytokines, different things that are activated by different inputs. So there are many ways to up or down regulate your overall inflammatory status. Seed oils directly attach themselves to two of those pro-inflammatory pathways and increase your inflammatory status. That's been demonstrated. That's locked in. That's not debatable. That is the fact. Seed oils are pro-inflammatory. We also know, those of us that understand the etiology of heart disease, that inflammation is the problem. Because also, by the way, if you're inflamed, your blood pressure goes up, and that increases the turbulence in your blood. Hello. So that's what we need to ameliorate to get rid of the scourge of heart disease, pretty much. Now, am I saying that before modern diets that heart disease was not a thing? No, it still occurred in some people. I mean, we have examples of quite old mummies that show some signs of heart disease, etc. All, by the way, like Egyptians and things like that were generally eating grains and probably fatty meat as well. Because if you're rich enough to be mummified, you're probably rich enough to eat meat as well as, you know. All speculations, I get it. Yes, they're speculations, but they seem reasonable to me. And then the other problem with unsaturated fatty acids, oils, is that they are subject to derangement in terms of chemical derangement like glycation, glucose damage, and or oxidation, damage by having electrons torn out of it. As soon as you do that to an oil, now it's an absolute inflammation nuclear weapon, if you like to think of it that way. And those oils can displace saturated fats in body structures and start interfering with their function. This is some of the nastiest, most insidious crap you could put into your body as a seed oil. No one should go near it with a barge pole.
Talk more about that latter part. I want to get into that. The fact that they're incorporated in the body and they're there for years. It's not like something you're taking in and having an acute effect. They're staying in the body for years.
Yep. I've seen a number of different numbers, but one of them I saw was like a half-life of 4 years. So if you had X concentration of polyunsaturates in your lipid rafts in your cells, like the cell membranes, and they were there and they were interfering with the function of that cell membrane because unsaturated chains aren't straight, so they don't fit properly. They push everything out of the way. And let's say you got a very small concentration of that in your cells, and that's damaging, absolutely. But it's going to take you 4 years to half replace those with good, straight, saturated ones again, is what we're saying. So it's going to be 8 years before you get to 25% of the damage ongoingly. Nasty stuff.
All right, so we've been talking about the PUFAs. Let's talk about monounsaturated fats, things like olive oil that are touted as healthy foods.
Okay. Olive oil, the monounsaturated part of olive oil is anti-inflammatory. It affects one of those pathways in such a way as to tone down inflammation. Unfortunately, most olive oils, even good quality ones, if indeed it is in fact olive oil that you're buying, by the way, that's for another day, most olive oils are 14 to 16% polyunsaturates. So sure, you're getting some oil that downregulates one pathway, but then you're getting a whack of other oils that upregulate too. Well, that's a good idea, isn't it? No. I don't touch oil myself. I don't cook with oil ever. I don't eat anything that's been produced commercially with oil in it, or pretty much at all, as it turns out. Yeah, it's just not something that I think human beings should go anywhere near.
Let's tie in olive oil to bad science, to the blue zones. So trying to tie a bunch of different areas together here, because earlier you talked about bad science. There's a lot of talk about the blue zones. There's, a new documentary on Netflix. A lot of people following that type of diet for the health benefits, apparently. And when I think of places like Greece, I think of olive oil. Let's pivot into the blue zones and talk about the science there and how you feel about what they're eating.
Right. Okay. The blue zones are 7 regions around the world identified by a journalist called Dan Buettner, wherein it was his belief, rightly or wrongly, that people tended to live longer in those particular 7, as it turns out, isolated geographical zones. The actual proof provided that any of those regions genuinely do have such a longevity pattern, i.e. show us some good records, birth, deaths and marriages, departments, whatever, from these. Okay. There's only one population that actually does have quite good records in that respect, and it's the Seventh-day Adventists of Loma Linda, California. The other ones that they talk about also being blue zones do not have the records to be able to substantiate the people's age there very well at all, in fact. Secondly, something like a hard-baked outcome of someone's life, how long do they live? How many billion independent and covariant crossover variables play into someone's lifespan? more than we can count, more than we could even conceive of, probably. So even if we had 7 populations of people around the world who were living on a largely plant-based diet, and those 7 populations seem to be the longest living in the world, so what? Because many things are related to many other things associated. Example, deaths by drowning in swimming pools and the release of movies starring Nicolas Cage. Now, I think there might be a connection there, but I can't prove it. However, what we can say from that is it's likely to be a spurious association, in that disallowing Nicolas Cage from releasing any further movies is not going to affect the rate of drowning in swimming pools, is it? Because there's no mechanism. Does that mean we should not ban Nicolas Cage? No, I think we should. But that's not anything to do with science. I just don't like him as an actor. Whatever. That's for another day. Like many things are for another day, I guess. So, I mean, does that cover it, or do you need more on that?
Let's go to Loma Linda.
Yeah.
Plant-based.
Yeah.
And coming back to how we opened up, talking about the carnivore diet being optimal, we got into the vegan diet last time. The diet is such a foundational piece for health. If the people, we could use Loma Linda again as an example, if they're missing the foundation, how can they live so long, or apparently live so long?
Okay, so the people in Loma Linda have a particular demographic at large, which may well predispose them to a longer lifespan than others. They tend to have so-called good levels of so-called education, good levels of household income. Their religious belief also, I believe, discourages them from smoking and drinking, which will affect someone's lifespan, absolutely. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's no way to say the difference between these people and everyone else is just the diet, because otherwise they're the same. They're not. They're a different population. While we're on it, like just for one example of yet more of the flaws, fallacies, and falsehoods of blue zones, the typical traditional diet of the Okinawans, mixed, actually, not plant-based. Largely pork, which is not a plant. And yet we're told that the Okinawans live on a plant-based diet. They don't. And they haven't done at any stage, except for a few years immediately following the war, because the pigs had all been killed.
I think part of the challenge here, too, is that term plant-based, where it's ambiguous. And does that include a little bit of meat? Is that vegan, vegetarian? It allows for a lot of gray.
Yeah, exactly. And science, while there is inherently in its design an amount of grey in science, usually for most scientists in most fields, the area of grey is 5% on likelihood of an outcome having happened due to dumb chance. So a properly controlled experiment with proper discipline can get somewhere near 95% surety on the results of that study and the extrapolability of those findings to other populations. But that's not what's being done. So we can't make those extrapolations. A classic example of such an extrapolation is people that talk about reading epidemiologically based or Mendelian-based studies and saying this is able to talk about cause and effect. No, it isn't.
Do you find any value to those studies?
No, well, yes. Such studies are, the place of those studies are hypothesis-generating pilot work.
A first step.
Yeah, a first step. Is there anything to underpin my idea that this might be connected to that? If we look at an observation in a large group of people, do we see it? Is it there? Yes. Okay. Now we need to do an experiment. Whoops, we can't do that. We can't experiment on human beings. So really, therefore, the value of that stuff is, number one, as publications for its authors, giving them activity to do in academia to justify their existence in academia. And the other purpose is in confusing people who are incompetent to read data sets and comment sensibly upon those data sets. And that includes most scientists, by the way. Many scientists with actually quite decent publication lists of their own could not do you a statistical analysis accurately and get the right answer, let alone critique someone else's work. So Joe Bloggs off the street has got no chance.
Let's come back to your diet. On a good day, because last time we talked, you are human and you do have slip-ups. So on a good day, you're eating one meal, carnivore.
Mm-hmm.
You're having
Yes.
not an insulin spike, but that gradual elevation and coming back down like we talked about before.
Yep.
For somebody that is going to adopt a carnivore or really low-carb diet, how important is that piece of having all the calories, there's that word again, calories, condensed within one meal? I know it's part of kicking you out of ketosis.
Yes.
How important is that? And is there any other reasons you do it that way?
Well, if you don't achieve a sufficient insulin spike at least once a day or every other day, for example, then what happens is a couple of things. First of all, your kidneys start leaking electrolytes progressively. That's probably not a great thing. And it can get to the point where no amount of supplementing with electrolytes can keep those electrolytes in your body because they just go straight out through your kidneys. Your kidneys require a relatively regular insulin spike. One of the things that insulin does is keep that kidney tissue viable to do its job in that way. You also need it to keep your thyroid function vital, it seems. So you really, it is important to achieve it. That's one of the reasons that I suggest one meal a day is ideal, because one meal a day is the most likely way that you're going to achieve it. Does that mean you can't achieve it by having two smaller meals? No, some people can. And if you're one of those people and you'd prefer to eat twice a day and you're doing well on two meals a day, then don't fix that. But if you're a person who's eating two or three smaller carnivore meals a day and is having problems like muscle twitching, especially in the legs, disturbed sleep patterns, heart palpitations, those kind of things, then I'd look at getting towards a one meal a day situation and possibly up your protein intake for a bit just to kick your body into it.
So given this ideal way of eating that you follow, you're naturally going to produce ketones for, say, 16 hours-ish a day. Is there value in the way you eat in doing that specifically for the ketones, or is that just a side, not benefit, but an aside that is just there?
Yeah. Okay. So there are those who claim things like ketones are directly anti-inflammatory. I'm not sure if it's the ketones that are anti-inflammatory or whether it's the whole process of ketogenesis that leads to an anti-inflammatory disposition. Maybe. Not sure. There are a number of companies selling exogenous ketones to people to take because they are touting that ketones themselves are of benefit. I don't buy it. The ketogenic pathway is just part of the normal metabolic pathway of human beings. It's developed over many thousands of millions of years, just like everything else. It has an exact role to play, and it plays that role exactly. That, it seems, is almost like a second messenger for the endocrine, hormonal systems, all that kind of stuff, as an indication to the body of its energetic status, among other things. Ketones also directly provide energy in the form of acetyl units, which can be fed directly into the Krebs cycle. So they're handy in that respect. But no, I don't think that somebody should rush off and buy supplements of ketones or search after ketones because ketones themselves are absolutely beneficial. Just not convinced.
A couple areas I'd like to specifically dive into in regards to ketones is mental health challenges and epilepsy, where ketones in those cases could be providing another source of energy for the brain.
Mm.
Do you see value and how do you think about that?
Well, the brain has a so-called energetic requirement. It's actually a requirement for substrate, mass. The brain is able to oxidize two different starting products for energy. They are glucose and ketones. Your brain can't use fat. When the level of glucose in the blood starts to drop, that shortfall is made up for by the ketone production. That's why it exists, to do exactly that. In deepest nutritional ketosis in a person who does not have diabetes, you're looking at a maximum contribution from ketones of around about 19 point something percent, it looks like, from the literature I've read. You're still 80% glucose in terms of the use of energy by your brain in the deepest, darkest pit of nutritional ketosis. So it's not like you're actually short of glucose. It's just that the ketones are making up that gap for now. So your brain's not suffering. It's not a starvation thing in any way, shape, or form. It's just your metabolism doing what it does, and that is maintain your homeostatic situation.
But the way I understand it, I haven't looked at the papers, but for cases where people are suffering from epilepsy, the ketogenic diet has been helpful in the realm of seizures. Have you looked at that?
Yeah, that was something that was done last century. That's not a new idea. That absolutely there seems to be some good evidence that a person who is in a ketogenic state a lot of the time is less likely to have seizures. Now, is that anything to do with the ketones, or is it because by virtue of that dietary pattern, it's likely that their inflammation is less? Maybe it was the inflammation that was tripping off the seizures. Obviously, you've got to be susceptible in the first place to those seizures, but maybe an inflammatory state sets them off more readily, and reducing inflammation might be the thing that's actually been at effect here. It might be nothing to do with the ketogenesis itself, per se. Does that make sense?
I hear what you're saying.
Hmm.
Take me to your dinner table now. We know you're doing this one meal a day, carnivore ideally. How much diversity is there, say in a week and a month, with what that meat is?
Okay, 80% of everything I eat is beef and beef fat with additional butter and salt. 20% of everything I eat when I'm on a day of being 100% carnivore is going to be any other animal-based product. So anything that's not beef or wasn't beef, 20% maximum. On a day where I have a potato crisp or two after the game or a bottle of beer after the game with the lads, then you'd adjust those figures accordingly on those days. But like a beer with the lads after sports is once a week if you're lucky, for half of the year if you're lucky. Crisps and bits of pizza and whatever else is probably pretty much associated with the sport as well. Not much of that happens around the house. We also live 35 minutes from the nearest town, so we can't just go down the shop and get it, which helps, by the way. Or we could, but as long as we want to drive 70 minutes for 5 seconds of oral pleasure, as it were.
When you have a steak, a fatty cut, will you eat all the fat? I'm assuming you would, but would you ever cut off any of the fat?
Okay, in our house, what happens is I normally cut off an amount of that steak and feed it to my partner because she loves it. I have more butter to make up for the loss of that. I actually don't like beef fat. I love lamb fat, though. I'll sit down and eat any amount of lamb fat. I love pork fat. I just don't like, there's something about beef fat that I don't like. So she gets that. And by the same token, if we're having lamb, it's the other way around because I love it. I get hers. So it evens out in that respect.
So it's a
But
preference thing.
yeah.
You're not fearing if there's a big lip of fat on the side of a steak. It's not because of the quantity of fat. It's just the fact you don't like it.
That's right. There's no need to fear fat. There's no evidence fat causes any kind of problem at all.
Talk about dairy. We know you're a fan of butter. How do you feel about, fermented dairy, yogurt form,
Okay,
milk,
yep.
kefir?
Milk is not on my agenda at all because I'm lactose intolerant. So that's just not part of my experience. Fermented seems to be okay. Like I have an amount of unsweetened Greek yogurt, for example, as part of my 20% outside of the beef. Sometimes I have that on the beef. Get this, small amount of very finely chopped up garlic or something in it like that for flavor. I know, that's not an animal. Goodness me. I should hand in my carnival card, shouldn't I? I never really was one.
What about cheese?
Cheese is not huge on my radar horizon. I don't eat a lot of cheese, but I've been known to eat cheese, absolutely.
When you talk about yogurt, it gets me thinking about fermented food as a whole. Obviously, given your diet, you don't have a lot of different inputs for that. But do you see value in having something like a yogurt to get probiotics or beneficial microbes into your body?
Every single thing you eat is a probiotic, a prebiotic. It comes with its own flora. You don't need to do anything specifically to add anything to your flora. Your flora will optimize to your diet over time. It's not something I even think about on a weekly, daily basis at all.
How do you look at hydration? Do you just go by thirst, or do you make sure you're consuming a certain amount of water per day?
No, I don't have a number. I don't have you must drink so much water because that's nonsense. Again, we have this thing called an instinct of thirst, and that's developed over a very long time in us. It's been very effective. It tells us when to start drinking and stop drinking. I listen to that.
All right, we've talked extensively about food and last time as well. Last time we got into the nutraceutical, the stem cell stimulant.
Yep.
We also want to make sure today we're covering the grounding. Last time we did generally cover all 5 of these, but I want to get into more depth on a couple of them, including the grounding. So talk about again how you incorporate that throughout the day.
Got it. Okay. So just before we move off the cerebral stem cell enhancing thing, which I'm happy to move off because we did cover it last time. Number one, please go and look at the interview that Jesse and I did a month or so ago. I don't know.
Maybe a month and a half, yeah.
It's covered in detail there if you want details. If you're prepared to just go and check it out for yourself, there's a lot of information online, both on my YouTube channel and also there. Right, enough said on that. Grounding. So what is grounding? Grounding is connecting yourself electrically to the earth. Well, when and how often? As much of the time as is physically possible and practical in your lifestyle. Because that's how we evolved, connected to the earth. It's only the last couple of 100 years at all that we've been disconnecting ourselves electrically from the earth. And it's not necessarily a good thing inflammation-wise and a bunch of other ways as well. I have a video on my channel called In 5 Minutes or Less where I'm talking about this, wherein I allude to, I think there's about 17 different pilot studies and bits of small-scale work that's been done on this to suggest that this is not just some kind of hippie crystal waving woo-woo. There is actually something to support these hypotheses, so check it out. But how do I incorporate it in my life? Here we go. On our bed, underneath the bed sheet on top of the mattress, is an electrically conductive mat, which just straps to the mattress using elastic straps. That has a wire that connects to a stake in the ground outside our property. We're on a fully detached, single-level, ground-level property. So we can do that. Metal stake in the ground, copper wire to the bed. So we're grounded when we sleep by way of perspiring, putting moisture into the sheet that we're lying on, and that makes the electrical connection with the mat underneath that sheet. So I sleep 8 to 10 hours a day. So there's 8 to 10 hours a day of grounding just by being in bed.
If you're away from
Pretty
home,
much.
I just want to jump in real quick. Do you notice a difference in your sleep if you're not grounded?
I think I do. But whether that's because I'm not grounded or because I'm somewhere strange, again, you could say, couldn't you? You could argue that. And I could say, absolutely, that would be a confounder. This is not a scientific thing. But yes, and people that ground while they sleep generally do tend to report better sleep. And one of those studies had a look at people's brainwave activity. And when they took a person who was not grounded and they grounded that person, the brainwave activity immediately changed from fight and flight to rest and recuperation. Interesting. So sleeping, grounded, 8 to 10 hours a day. That's great. Everybody can do that. Even if you only sleep 6 or 7 hours a day, you can do that. You can ground that much. When I'm not sleeping, generally what I do is I walk down the hallway to the other end of the house and I sit in this chair to make videos, to record as we are doing now, to comment on who's wrong on the interwebs this week, because that doesn't look like slowing down, and to run all the other businesses that I run here from this chair. While I'm doing that, the mouse pad on my desk is the same sort of thing. It's a much smaller version, but it's a grounded sheet that connects to a wire that goes to a stake outside in the ground. So I work 8 to 10 hours a day, sometimes 12, depending what's going on. So most of the time, I'm grounded. When I'm not doing that, I'm either not grounded or I'm might just directly ground to the earth itself. I might be outside, take my shoes and socks off and put your feet on the grass. Well, where the grass was. It's very brown here right now. It's just dirt and dead grass.
Do you feel like there's a difference between using these pads and getting your feet directly on the ground?
There's no sensation that you're even aware of.
No, not aware of, but benefits.
Well, I don't know, because I use the mixed methodologies, don't I? So I can't scientifically separate those out and say, oh, this is better than that. Maybe that's an experiment somebody might want to do. I don't think so. I mean, being electrically earthed is being electrically earthed. It doesn't matter if you are connected directly to the earth or whether you are connected to the earth through a connection pathway. It's the same thing. What's happening is your body is absorbing electrons directly out of the earth into your body. There is, if you like, a small flow of electricity from the earth into your body. And those electrons that your body is absorbing are finding electron holes in things like proteins and fats and whatever else that have been torn out by oxidants. And that's your antioxidant, the electron. Antioxidants in food is just a food-based molecule like vitamin C, which is also known to donate electrons. There's no different.
I noticed for both of your pads, you talked about grounding them right into the ground with a stake. I know for devices like you're talking about, you can plug them directly into the grounding part of a wall socket.
Yes.
You don't do that though.
No, I do have that kit available. I've got a 3-pin power plug, which has 2 pins that are just plastic dummies with no wires, and that's the active electricity. The earth pin is the metal pin. That's the thing that's got a wire. You can stick that in. Yeah, you can.
The way I understand it, you have to be careful and make sure that's actually grounded though.
Yep.
Sometimes it might not be connected and people would want to test for that. Obviously, be safe when you're doing that.
That's right. Yeah. If it's not connected to the earth, there's no danger because it's just an earth pin that's not connected, meaning it won't work. To test, just put a multimeter across yourself and you should be in the millivolts range if you're grounded. If you're much more than that with respect to ground, then you're not grounded. Pretty much.
The other piece of controversy I've heard around grounding is making sure and this isn't my area of expertise, but that the ground doesn't have dirty electricity, or it's healthy ground to be grounded on. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. Okay. So dirty electricity refers to an induced current which is caused by inducing different voltages in the earth wire by the active wires interfering with the earth wire. How does that work? An electrical current flowing through a wire creates a magnetic field around that wire. That magnetic field, if it interacts with another wire which is close by, can induce a current in that wire. So, for example, when you think about overhead power lines at 50,000 volts, if they turn one of two of them off, they're not going to get up there and touch the one they've just turned off because it's still live. It's being induced by the other one. They've got to turn them both off. Dirty electricity is that induction in that earth wire, and it can't be avoided other than with quite technical filtration equipment and things, quite expensive kit. It's a risk you take when you use the plug it into the wall option because you have no other option. For example, maybe you don't live at ground level, maybe you're in a flat situation, something like that. Maybe you're on the 37th floor, whatever it is. Another way that you can ground if you don't want to use the wall socket is you can actually ground off against any relatively large piece of metal, like a radiator. That works too, because a metal will donate electrons to you because you have a positive electrochemical charge overall. So you're always going to draw electrons to you. And the metal will happily give them off. So that works too.
Okay. Another thing I've heard is that grounding helps mitigate EMFs. Have you heard that at all? And are EMFs something you're concerned about, you try and protect against?
Right. Concern would be too strong. I would suggest that my knowledge on long-term effects of various kinds of EMF on the human body that's not my area of expertise. I wouldn't suggest for a second. Am I concerned about EMF at the current power at which EMFs are typically being bathed in? I'm not personally concerned about that. EMF can clearly mechanistically be a problem at much, much higher power than what we're currently being exposed to. Sure. There are people who are highly sensitive to it and who do notice and who do get physiological responses to the EMF at the levels that we currently have. Sure. But they are one end of a bell-shaped curve. They are not a typical responder. And those people might do well to set themselves up with a Faraday cage situation for their bedroom at least. Maybe they want to turn off their router at night. Don't know.
Do you do either of those two things?
No, I don't. I'm not concerned.
Let's move into blue light. We, again, touched on this last time, but you wear orange lenses at night.
Yep.
When do you put those on? How strict are you about doing that?
Okay. I'm not that strict. I should be, but I'm not. It is number 4 on the list in importance, not number 1. So, ergo, If I'm out and about somewhere at night, I'm not going to put them on because I don't want to, appear the loon sort of thing, for example. Or maybe I just didn't take them with me and didn't think about it, whatever. But at home, mostly if I'm going to be looking at one of these screens, like I'm looking at now, a computer screen or a phone screen a lot or something like that, then I would put the blue blocking specs on. Others take it much more seriously. Like people like Harry Sopanos, a good friend of mine, who is currently banned from being on YouTube for saying naughty things. Anyway, that's for another day. He, for example, has removed every light bulb from his property and replaced them all with amber light bulbs that have no blue in them. Okay. At $30 a bulb? Well, great, Harry. If If that's what gets you through the night, baby, you go for it. But I'm not going to do that personally.
The way I understand it, to a smaller effect, and this ties into the bulbs, the skin is photosensitive as well.
Yes.
So do you try and block anything from your skin, or you just focus on the eyes?
No, I don't. No. Yeah. The eyes are by far the more important signaling mechanism, it seems. Now, could I improve? Could I do that? Absolutely, I could. But again, let's get back to reality and being a human being here. If I did all of these 5 things absolutely, completely religiously every day, if there were many people around me that all think I'm a loon, well, a lot of people think I am anyway, but that's fine. Luckily, there aren't that many people around me, and that's the way I like it. People are awful, Jesse, aren't they? Yeah. No, I love you all, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just not something that, as I say, it's number 4 on my list. So I make a decent effort at it. I'm not going to be that anal about anything below, well, level 3, really.
All right, we're going to get to number 5. Before we do, how much, if you had to break it up into, say, a pie chart, one carnivore diet being the most important, how much of the chart would that take up, the dietary piece, as a foundation here?
75, easily. And then 20 for cereal products on top of that. So we're already up to 95 at number 2. 4.5% for electrical grounding, effectively. So you've got 0.5% left for number 4 and number 5 in terms of importance in my mind. That's my model. I can hear people jumping up and down, source, like as if, number 1, you could actually competently read a source if I gave you one, because you're not a scientist and you couldn't. Isn't that right? You spotty little basement dweller. I just like have fun with this kind of stuff.
Well, given the 70% for diet, as you say that, it gets me thinking back to Loma Linda. If they're so off on that foundational piece, which we talked about before, but let's come back to it. How can someone eating plant-based, missing so much of the pie, still apparently thrive, not just survive?
Right. Around about
and I want to extrapolate beyond Loma Linda. I just want to come in, and we did talk about this last time, but let's talk about people that are only eating plants.
Right.
And some people apparently are doing really well on that.
Okay, that brings in the Adventist Health Study number 2, which was done on the Loma Linda population in the 90s. All completed in the 90s, I think, from memory. Don't quote me on that number. Here are the numbers that you should quote me on. Around about 8.5% of the Loma Linda Seventh-day Adventist population are actually vegans. A very small proportion of them, as it turns out. The rest of them are mostly vegetarians, ovo, lacto, or maybe including fish, some of them. And the other end of the bell-shaped curve is the ones that are eating any amount of meat to speak of. So actually what you have largely is a population of omnivores. And we all know what the problem with the omnivore diet is as a human being, don't we? It's called the Randle cycle. Whoops, inflammation and earlier death. However, does that mean that the vegan diet is better for lifespans and for various serious disease processes than, say, the meat-based diet? There's not much to go on there, but what there is to go on in that Adventist Health Study is this. They had 5 subpopulations. The vegans, the first quartile of meat consumption, the second, third, and fourth quartiles of meat consumption. They were your 5 groups. So the comparator was the vegans, and that was with respect to the first, second, third, or fourth quartile of meat consumption as the pairwise comparisons they made. Here's what they found. The highest rate of mortality per person per year of follow-up was in the vegans. The highest rate of heart attacks was in the vegans. The highest rates of cancer were in the vegans. etc., etc., etc. The vegans fared the worst on every metric in terms of serious disease process and mortality from all causes. The next worst was the first quartile of meat consumption. The next best one was the second, etc., to the point where the lowest incidence of disease process and mortality was in the people who ate the most meat. And then what they did is they adjusted their data so hard as to invert it 180 degrees on itself, and they reported this fabricated risk ratio thing that they put together using a completely inappropriate statistical skullduggery. And they reported that the vegans did the best and the meat eaters that ate the most meat did the worst. It's a lie. This is what I mean about people reading papers, reading the conclusion of the papers as written by the authors and going, well, that's what the paper says, when they couldn't themselves go to that data set and find out what I found out by going to that data set. That's why I'm saying that all these people talking about science who are not trained scientists should stop it, because you're just promulgating the lie. Those authors lied. They are theologically based people. They've published in a theologically based journal, and what they've published is theological nonsense, completely divorced from the reality of the observations they actually made. Now, a scientist reports what they observed, don't they? Not some fantasy they made up to suit their theology. I hope that gets to your question. I think it does.
It's interesting. You mentioned the vegans fared the worst. As you shared that, it got me thinking about the Randle cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And they would have been on basically very high carb. So wouldn't that have protected them in that respect?
From the Randle cycle issue to a point, because the most powerful way you can activate that Randle cycle issue is by having mixed macros. If you have a diet which is based largely on one or the other, that will largely alleviate that particular issue. However, if the means that you apply to solve that problem causes even worse problems, then it's not really a solution, is it? That's why the vegans fared worst. It's because of the nutritional destitution in that dietary practice, I would say. It's not really a Randle cycle issue per se.
How do you think about quality? Last time you talked about how you have a cow right outside your window, and it sounds like you eat predominantly hyper local. And I'm assuming, and I'll have you elaborate on this, is that cow eating, primarily grass? How do you feel about people that are carnivore or heavily animal based,
Yeah.
but don't worry about quality at all?
I think to each his own, to be honest.
From a
If
health
you wanna
perspective, not judging them as people, but from health.
Right, yeah. From a health perspective, it seems like, okay, the most damaging chunk out of 100% vital, healthy, fit and ready to go that you can cause yourself would be taking a 100% carnivore diet and making it more like 95%, just a 5% transgression. A few chips here and there, a beer or two with the lads after sport. This kind of stuff I do. 5% transgression shouldn't be a big deal. You shouldn't get much of a penalty on a 5% transgression against the law. However, this is not a legal system. There's no equality or fairness involved in this. This is what it is. And I can tell you that a 5% transgression nets a vastly bigger deficit to your health, both acutely and somewhat ongoingly, than it should. That 5% plant material or stuff derived from plant materials, that's the stuff that apparently seems to do the damage, because there doesn't seem to be a hill of beans difference between eating grass-fed beef and grain-finished beef. Okay, there's a slight change in the fatty acid profiles. Well, convince me that that's a problem over a lifespan and I'll be interested. I really don't think it is. If you can't get locally reared, locally raised, grass finished beef, don't die in a ditch over that. I mean, it may not be affordable for you on a case-by-case basis. Who knows? The main thing is that you eat meat and animal fat and not plants to the best of your ability, as close to 100% as you can get. And any small transgression, probably you're going to get a worse outcome than you think would be fair or reasonable. That's just the way it is. That's something I've had to learn over the last, 9.5 years, I guess. Is that every time I transgress, I pay a price for it for at least 48 hours. Terrible price. It's just not worth it. But I do it anyway because I'm a human being and I'm socializing with the lads at sport or after sport, sometimes during sport.
And there's benefit to the social aspect. And that's where it gets all gray and yeah.
Of course. It's fuzzy from that point. Yep. So in terms of you asked about my particular individual situation. Yes, an amount of the beef that we eat was raised on this property. Not all of it, because this is not actually a full working farm. This is a farmlet, a small farm. Currently, there is one cow here. Okay. Usually there are 2 cows here, and at some point soon again, there will be 2. So that's hyper local, because the home kill people come in, they kill the animal here on this property, it's butchered just down the road, and then they bring it back. Cool. Other than that, we drive 35 minutes into the nearest town that has a decent butchery to get additional meat that doesn't come from this property. And it's all local stuff with this butcher, so we know it's all come from this area. In terms of what they eat, all cows in New Zealand are basically grass-fed and grass-finished. The grain feeding is just not a thing here. We don't do that in New Zealand. We don't need to. We're closer to the equator than you guys are. We have grass all year round, mostly, except for right now at the end of high summer where we don't have any grass left to speak of because it's all burned off by the sun and stuff and it having not rained for weeks, in which case they eat hay. Said hay having grown on this property when it did rain some months earlier.
So hypothetical situation, given what you just shared, the fact that 5% sneaking in actually does make a big difference for health. Would you rather, and this is just a thought experiment, have that 5% sneak in of, beer and crisps you mentioned, and then have the rest of your diet be, beef that's grass finished, or base an all meat diet around conventional meat, hot dogs, processed meat in there, things like that?
Okay, processed meat is a problem if it gets over a certain level, and again, that's individual. I tend personally to stick around fresh meat rather than preserved or highly processed stuff. I wouldn't suggest a person ought to base their diet on that stuff.
Okay, important we got into that. And obviously, as people that eat meat, I'm sure you're in this boat too, definitely I am, we try and do the best we can when it comes to ethics and treatment of animals.
Sure.
No, I just thought I'd throw that in there as we're sharing all this. It kind of can sound like we're being brutal to the animals. No, we want animal welfare is of importance.
Of course it is. Yeah. And the standards in New Zealand are very good in terms of animal welfare and all of that kind of stuff.
How do you feel about eggs and seafood, including fish?
Yeah, look, eggs and seafood are absolutely perfectly valid and viable components of that 20% discretion that I was talking about outside the 80% beef. I wouldn't base my diet on either of those things, but they absolutely can be in there. So long as you're not a person that reacts negatively to either of those things. A lot of people are sensitive to eggs. Yep. Great source of nutrition. Absolutely fine. No problem.
All right. Which leads to omega-3s. And those are going to be in grass-finished beef to a point. But is there enough there to support not just surviving, but thriving because a lot of people in the health space talk about the benefits of fish oils, seafood, providing those omega-3s, DHA, EPA. And then when I think DHA, I think of brain health.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think about all that? I'm assuming you'd say beef is enough, but I'll have you expand.
You assumed correctly. I am going to say the amount of omega-3 fatty acid that you derive from beef is sufficient, with the caveat that 80% of what you're eating is beef and beef fat, and 20% of what you're eating is other animal products. Okay. The thing with omega-3 is it's not actually, there is an absolute amount that you require. It's an essential nutrient. That's a very, very small amount though. And that's why I'm saying that which is in beef is sufficient for life, for ongoing vitality and health, and etc. There are people claiming benefit in omega-3 oil taken additionally, in that it seems actually that the ratio between omega-3 and omega-6 in your diet is a powerful mediator of your inflammatory status once again. So the benefit of omega-3, additional to what you find in the meat, is only valid if you are also eating omega-6, which is a polyunsaturated fatty acid, which you should not be eating a significant amount of, other than that which actually exists in the fat of the animal. There is actually some in there, by the way. People think animal fat is 100% saturated. No, it isn't. No, not at all, in fact. It looks like eating meat is enough. Here's the issue with supplementing with omega-3. There's a study done by a very, very intelligent and very, very attractive young Swedish investigator by the name of P-I-M, Jansson. Happens to be my partner as well, by the way. And some other clown that she was working with on a study that she did once, some bald bloke. And what those investigators found was that 2/3 of commercially available omega-3 supplements, even good quality ones, were badly, badly rancid at the time of purchase, to the point where they had very, very dangerous primary and secondary oxidation products in them, such as aldehydes. Now, aldehydes of the kind that we found are the kind of things that tear lipid rafts to bits, bind to DNA and cause change in that DNA, whoops, kill cell organelles, cause cell self-destruction, really, really nasty, really toxic stuff in very, very low concentrations. 2/3 high-quality omega-3 supplements, rancid as hell. Whoops. Not the thing to be doing.
If somebody is going to include one of those, given what you just shared, any specific brands or things to look for to know that we're getting something of high quality?
Right, okay. I am not aware of any country that has a statute requiring omega-3 products to be below a certain level of aldehydes. And even if there was a below a certain level, that wouldn't be particularly helpful because there is no safe limit. Any amount of aldehydes, whoops, big problem here. Number two, the only way to find this stuff, the way we found it, which was a scanner called a magnetic resonance spectroscopy machine. These cost millions and millions and millions of dollars, these bits of machinery. You're not going to get one in your house. And no company is required to tell you anything about this at all. So my answer for omega-3 supplementation is don't. Personally, I think it's an absolute contraindication. I would not touch an omega-3 supplement with a barge pole, personally.
Got it. Okay. Let's move into number 5. You've already broken down your day. I think you said 8 to 10 hours in bed. You're working, 10 to 12 hours?
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that, how are you moving your body?
Okay, I play sport once a week. on a Saturday for 8 or 10 hours in a very low intensity sport. It's cricket. It's all power and skill based, really. It's not really a fitness sport to speak of, really. So that's kind of, I play old men's cricket, low grade stuff once a week. When I'm able to, I would also train for that sport during the on and off seasons once a week. However, I'm not particularly training at the moment because I have injuries to both ankles, as it turns out. It's just the way things work out. You injure one ankle, and I suppose it's likely you might hurt the other one because of corrective things you do and not taking time off properly and rehabilitating properly. And I actually did an Achilles injury that really needs a surgical repair, and I just haven't had that repair done because I don't want to. So it's healed, but it's never going to be right until I do go and get that surgery. So my gait is always going to be off, and so that's going to subject me to the likelihood of hurting the other one, which I have done. So at the moment, there's not a lot of training going on at all. Just playing sport very badly once a week for a bit.
For somebody that wants to maximize health benefits from moving their body, what are they looking to include?
Right, 4
And then
sessions
what
a week.
mistakes are people making that are trying to exercise, but they're really not getting the benefits they think they are?
Got it. Okay. 4 sessions a week of not longer than 45 minutes of activity time in any one of those sessions at an intensity which will cave you in by the end of that 45 minutes. High intensity, burst and repeat is better. Resistance training, weights, machines, elastic bands, those kind of things, fantastic. Very, very low intensity, all-day activities, walking, playing a game of cricket, something like that, fine. The thing to absolutely not do is all this zone 2 endurance, aerobic or cardiovascular style training. Do not do that. And if you say, oh, but my sport requires me to do that, then my suggestion is you rethink your sport.
Early in our conversation, we talked about fat loss. Let's end on this, given now we've shared all the pillars and nuance to all this. Somebody at this point who's been stuck when it comes to weight loss, more specifically fat loss, give them very high level of what they would do specifically after this chat.
Well, it really depends on what the likely cause of a plateau in. When you say weight loss, I'm assuming you mean fat loss.
Yes, exactly.
Because it's not the same thing.
No, I clarified that. You might have missed it. I clarified.
I'm sorry if I did. Yes. All right. No, I would absolutely talk to that person probably in a consultancy session for an hour or so to get to the bottom of what the likely cause of their plateau and fat loss is. And then there are different tools in my kit bag that I use with consultancy clients to help them break through such plateaus, of course. And it involves dietary tweaking, it involves a bit of lifestyle tweaking, and it can involve some tweaking of their exercise program. Absolutely. Most typically a person on a carnivore diet or close to carnivore diet who has got to a plateau needs to understand several things. Number one, the weight will come off when the inflammation is resolved. If you are inflamed, you will not be particularly successful in weight loss. You might be able to do it, but it will be a hard road. It will be tough yards. That's why I suggest to people that the 5 pro-inflammatory life hacks that we've been talking about today is, in my mind, in my experience with real people in the real world, a very effective program at getting things going in the right direction for them. So that's why I suggest it. It's not just because I made this stuff up for fun. It's because I've dealt with thousands and thousands of clients over the years since I quit being a theoretical academic and found that what I was convinced of as an academic turned out to be true in the real world. So I'm just continuing it, basically. So that's the first thing. How long does it take to get the inflammation off? Depends. That's individual, and it's based on exactly how adherent you are to those 5 points. You'll find a balance that works for you in your life or that you're prepared to accept. Would I like to be slightly more healthy than I am now? Absolutely. Would I like to pay the price of that extra 5%? Well, obviously not just now, but we'll get to a point probably where I will. As I age and my body becomes less and less able to deal with that small transgression, maybe I'll be more and more strict with myself. Who knows? We'll see. The second thing is that the most common cause for people who plateau out on their weight loss on carnivore is they're eating too much protein for them, for their needs. So we can sit down and work that out and get that right. Beyond that, there are other things, but they're much less common. You're inflamed or you're eating too much protein or both.
All right, Bart.
Too much protein gets converted to sugar, by the way, and that's why you're staying fat. Right, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say that's a great place to end it. We came full circle and wrapped it up nicely. And we're going to link up your YouTube channel, your supplement, your website, everything in the show notes so people can find everything. And thank you for coming back on.
Beautiful. Thanks for having me. It was an absolute pleasure and a privilege. And I'm just glad to be able to get in front of more people so that they can see. Well, really, this is the take-home message. If nothing else, this is the take-home message. There is no good science existing that can inform us on this stuff. That's why these discussions continue. If we knew the answers, there'd be nothing to talk about anymore. So all of you in the comments section who are furiously typing away, oh, he never gives us any references, never gives us any sources. There aren't any. I can talk about the sources you offer up to me as evidence and tell you why they're no good. For example, the Adventist Health Study number 2, we covered that one today. It's no good. It doesn't even say what the authors claim it says, for example. I don't need to provide you with references. All I need to do is knock yours over. Don't you get that? I hope you do. See you next time. Anyway.
Thanks again, Bart.
Cheers.
Now that you're done with Bart, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Dr. Sean. He's a carnivore MD who will teach you all about how to reverse visceral fat. I'll see you over there.
Nothing that I'm aware of as a physician whose passion is to help people become